Hello, I'm the Game Professor and welcome to Games as Lit 101. Video games have changed a whole lot since their inception decades ago, and today we're going to talk about one particular facet of their evolution, the shift from challenging the player to giving them an experience. With all the fancy graphics and 100+ hour games we have nowadays, it can be easy to forget that video games have their origins in far, far simpler territory. Not even talking about Pac-Man or Galaga, but simpler games like Pong and Space War, and going back even further, games that blurred the lines between physical and digital, like pinball. Obviously, a whole lot has changed, but this one particular difference is very important to understanding video games as the complex artistic medium they've become, rather than the relatively simple medium they started out as. So let's take a look at what this difference looks like in action. Let's use Tetris as an example, because everyone's played Tetris. And if you're shaking your head right now because you haven't played Tetris, I can only assume that you either lived in Antarctica for the last few decades with no contact whatsoever from the outside world, or that Tetris was simply before your time and you don't have the good sense to play the classics. Either way, get on that. Anyway, we all know how this goes. Blocks fall one at a time in one of a few shapes, chosen randomly, and you need to move and rotate them to fit them in well at the bottom. Once you create a full line, it disappears, giving you more room to work. But over time, the game moves faster and faster, and if it ever stacks all the way to the top of the screen, it's game over. Though it would be more appropriate to say when it stacks all the way up to the top, because it will, eventually. Always. The original Tetris, at least. There have been some remakes that add an ending and allow you to complete the game, but the original game was not designed that way. Eventually, everything just gets too fast and you're overcome. Compared to how games are usually made now, this is a pretty huge difference in design. The goal of the game is simply to play as well as you can until you eventually lose. Victory isn't in completing the game's challenges, but pushing through them long enough to get a good score. And most classic arcade games are like this. Pac-Man, Galaga, Centipede, Missile Command, Space Invaders, basically all the classic early video games were designed not to be completed, but to challenge you to get as many points as possible before you inevitably lost. Much of this is of course due to the fact that these games were generally made for the arcades, so inevitable death led to more quarters being plopped into the machine so you could try and beat your high score. But of course, over time, video games began to grow, and they became experiences that were too large to reasonably play standing in an arcade. We'll look to Super Mario Bros. As an example here. Challenge is obviously still a major element of the game, and it even still has a points system. But Super Mario Bros. Has an ending, and the ultimate goal is to overcome the obstacles and get to it. The goal is no longer to do as well as you can until your inevitable demise, but instead to get through the game's unique, progressively changing challenges and get to the end of it. This was the beginning of a major shift in focus. Video games were no longer simply about skill, but rather about using skill to get through an experience. The arcade games of old would get more challenging as they went on, but they generally did this with little to no change. No matter how far you got in Pac-Man, the game remained essentially the same, with only occasional minor changes to the map layout. It wasn't designed to lead you through to the end, but make its basic structure more and more challenging until it eventually overcomes you. In contrast, Super Mario Bros. Offered unique level design and new challenges all the way up to the final level. The design is about bringing you through a series of distinct, increasingly difficult challenges until you complete them all. The result is that you can basically experience everything Pac-Man has to offer in a few minutes of play, but you can't truly experience Super Mario Bros. Until you play it all the way through to the end. This is the major difference in these two kinds of design. One puts a challenge in front of you to see how long you can keep it up and how well you can do, and the other provides you with a long-term challenge that ramps up as it introduces new design elements and takes you through new, unique challenges. There's still a lot of emphasis on challenge, but there's the added emphasis of an experience, the sense that this game is a complete work with a beginning, middle, and end. And of course, this was just the beginning of this shift, and there was a lot of ground left to cover. Over time, more games began experimenting aesthetically and expanding the range of experiences this medium could deliver. You could explore alien worlds in Metroid, defeat powerful monsters in Castlevania, zoom through the world of Sonic, face all sorts of foes in Mega Man, gather power to save the world in Final Fantasy, and adventure across Hyrule in The Legend of Zelda. More often than not, when we look back on these games, we'll remember a sense of adventure and excitement more than we'll remember our struggle for dominance. We began looking at video games not just as a chance to test our skill, but as an opportunity to go on an adventure. Generally, skill has still remained a very important element of the video game medium, but it is that. It's an element, and not the ultimate goal of the game's engagement. For instance, in Final Fantasy, there is certainly a challenge in defeating more and more powerful enemies, but rather than being the end-all of the game's experience, it's part of a process of becoming more and more powerful, leveling up and taking on even more epic enemies in a quest to save the world. Games like this didn't capture our imagination by making us strive for a high score, they used the challenge of their design to give us an adventure. That was, of course, a long time ago now, and at this point this emphasis on experience over challenge is par for the course in this medium. You need to have a level of skill to get through a Call of Duty campaign, but what really matters is the exciting experience of being a war hero. Open-world games like Red Dead Redemption are remembered not for how hard they were, but how engrossing the game world was to explore. A whole genre of games is based on eliminating challenge altogether to simply involve you in a compelling story. Even games that are all about challenge, like the Souls series and Bloodborne, use the difficulty as an element of an overall experience that ultimately leads to a satisfying conclusion. The ultimate effect of this shift is that video games are no longer just about testing your skill, they're about taking you through a world and through a story. As this shift has continued, we've seen a number of differences in the ways that video games are designed. Platformers have largely done away with the life system that used to be par for the course for the genre. The idea of save points has been largely giving way to games that let you save wherever and whenever you want. Even regenerating health in shooters is an example of this. All of these things allow creators of a video game to plan out each encounter and challenge, and more effectively curate the experience as a whole. Now, you may be asking what this means to the topic of this show, since Games as Lit 101 is specifically about storytelling in video games. Well, the effects are far-reaching and fundamental to modern game design, but there are a few major ones that we can easily point out. Firstly, this is a major element in what really allows games to be art. We can argue for game design as art, and could argue for aesthetic elements in classic arcade games, but any traditional definition of art would have trouble stretching itself to include most early games. They ultimately didn't exist to express any ideas or make any statements, but to entertain and challenge people. That isn't without value, but it's not artistic value, at least not the way we generally think of art. But an emphasis on a full experience over a high score lends itself well to communicating and expressing ideas, which is, of course, a very important thing for art to do. If someone is to understand that video games are an art form, one of the first and most vital steps is recognizing that they have grown past their initial incarnations. And in terms of the effects on storytelling specifically, this is one of those things that really even allows video games to tell stories in the first place. I mean, if you can never finish a story the same way you can't ever really finish an arcade game, what would the point even really be? And aside from that, the further we've pushed the boundaries of this concept, the more we've been able to broaden the kinds of experiences that we can have in video game stories. So, for instance, failure is now something that can be part of a video game story, rather than just the end-all game over it used to be. From the classic boss you can't beat, to stories where the protagonist makes a bad choice, the player's progression is no longer inherently dependent on their constant skill-based victory, because their success, or the success of the character they play, isn't the end-all of the experience, but merely a part of it. And as we've pushed this concept even further, we've even managed to create narrative experiences that don't rely on skill much, if at all, instead choosing to focus exclusively on the player's interaction with a story, world, or idea. I certainly think that's a good thing, and I imagine you do too, but if you don't, feel free to talk about why in the comments. If you enjoyed the episode, consider hitting that subscribe button, and also check the description for Games as Lit 101 on Facebook and Twitter. There's also a link to Patreon down there in case you enjoy the show enough to support it. A few weeks from now, as per your vote, I'm going to be analyzing Metroid Other M. So, in keeping with the theme of terrible stories, next week I'll be talking about Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series and why it might actually have been better if it was a video game. So, until then, class dismissed.